tardes a todos. A nombre de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez quisiera darles la bienvenida a este seminario organizado por la Cátedra Edmund Burke, que dirige nuestra destacada historiadora y parte de nuestra casa, Lucía Santa Cruz. Y quisiera partir por darles un poquito de contexto respecto de las cátedras, contarles que el año 2015 la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez inauguró 4 cátedras que intentan difundir y reflexionar en torno al pensamiento de 4 autores seminales. Alexis de Tocqueville, cátedra que dirige el profesor Oscar Godoy; la cátedra Adam Smith, que dirige el profesor Leonidas Montes; la cátedra Friedrich von Hayek, que dirige Axel Kaiser; y por supuesto la cátedra Burke, con Lucía Santa Cruz aquí presente. Estas cátedras y el pensamiento de los autores que las inspiran son consustanciales a las ideas contenidas en la misión de nuestra universidad, y que básicamente son entregar una educación basada en la libertad y la responsabilidad individual que permita a nuestros estudiantes desarrollar la totalidad de sus talentos, de su potencial intelectual y humano. Las cátedras conversan además con el sello académico en artes liberales de la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, y que es el eje medular de la formación actual de todos nuestros alumnos. Porque más allá de las competencias técnicas específicas de las distintas carreras, en la UAI estamos convencidos de que la formación del pensamiento crítico, de la reflexión y de la argumentación son piedras angulares no solo para tener mejores profesionales al final del día, mejores egresados, sino que también mejores ciudadanos, con capacidad de tener pensamiento crítico y autónomo sobre los temas complejos de nuestra sociedad. En este contexto, que hoy tenemos el placer de albergar este seminario con la destacadísima presencia de Jesse Norman, doctor en filosofía por el University College de Londres, es miembro del Parlamento inglés y también miembro del gobierno de Theresa May actualmente. A través de su libro The Big Society, muy conocido en Chile porque hubo una muy buena traducción que efectuó Pablo Ortúzar, este libro pone un gran acento en el rol de la sociedad civil. Y en este sentido, Jesse es uno de los responsables, me atrevería a decir, de los responsables intelectuales de la profunda renovación que tuvo el Partido Conservador Inglés, una renovación que se ha traducido en uno de sus ciclos políticos más exitosos del último tiempo. Pero además de un gran político, es un tremendo intelectual. En adición al citado Big Society, Jesse Norman es autor de varios libros, entre los que destaco Compassionate Economics, Compassionate Conservatism, y por supuesto Edmund Burke, Philosopher, Politician and Prophet. Quisiera agradecer muy sinceramente a Jesse por la generosidad de interrumpir su ocupada agenda y venir a Chile por tan solo unos pocos días, además a sabiendas que estuvo a punto de no venir puesto que su avión tuvo que ser devuelto en el primer intento, así que llegó recién esta mañana. Gracias, Jesse, por tu generosidad. El seminario de hoy indaga sobre una pregunta clásica y fundamental en la categorización del pensamiento de Burke. ¿Cuál es si acaso Burke es liberal o es conservador? De hecho, al igual que en el caso de Tocqueville, más de un experto coloca a Burke en las dos categorías, en la categoría de liberal-conservador. Liberal, porque en tanto tal siempre abogó por la limitación del poder de la realeza, pero también con la misma vara criticó a los jacobinos en la Revolución Francesa. Liberal, porque en el plano económico fue un gran defensor del libre comercio, del libre mercado y un profundo crítico de los controles de precios. Y a este respecto es famosa la cita en que el propio Adam Smith señalara o dijera sobre Burke que era el único hombre que conocía que pensara en temas económicos exactamente como él, pero sin jamás haber tenido comunicación alguna entre ellos. Por otro lado, el alma conservadora de Burke se expresa en que confería gran importancia a la tradición, a la religión y a la comunidad. En este sentido, él visualiza el contrato social no como una entelequia abstracta, aquí la crítica directa a Rousseau es bastante evidente, sino que como un pacto entre los muertos, los vivos y los que están por nacer, cimentada a través de vínculos emocionales anclados en instituciones. Sobre esta dualidad liberal-conservadores que vamos a discutir hoy, y qué mejor expositor que Jesse Norman, que no solo ha plasmado esta dualidad en su actuar político, reivindicando eso que bautizó como conservantismo de libre mercado, sino que además en tanto autor de su aclamado libro sobre Burke, pero también de uno sobre Adam Smith que aparecerá en los próximos meses, esperamos. Así que sin más, yo quisiera nuevamente darle la bienvenida a Jesse, a Lucía, gracias por esta oportunidad y a todos ustedes por estar en la Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez esta tarde. Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction, Ignacio, and thank you, Lucia, for hosting me, and Leonidas for bringing me here. And thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for giving up a marvelous evening, the first evening of spring in Santiago, in order to come and talk and think about history and ideas. I'm enormously grateful to you. This is my fourth visit to Chile. I first came in 2010 and spoke at the Bicentenary Dialogues. And then I came again in 2012 to talk about the big society. And in 2014, I snuck a visit in with my wife, who's over there. I'm going to embarrass her, Kate, and our children. And we went to Atacama, and we went on horses up into the mountains here, and got very, very wet indeed, and spent Christmas Eve eating an asado and swimming in a hot spring while the rain poured down in the middle of a cloud. We are with our packs on our horses full of Christmas stocking presents for our children. So I have the best possible feelings about this country, and I love coming back here, and it's been a tremendous pleasure to do that, notwithstanding the efforts of British Airways to stop us when we first got on the flight. Ladies and gentlemen, let me plunge in as in a way that I think you will find fitting. On January the 17th, 1766, just over 250 years ago, there was a debate in Parliament, that's the British Parliament, on the repeal of the Stamp Act, the act by which Britain charged a stamp duty on all documents used in the colonies, particularly the American colonies. It was a tumultuous moment in British history. The question was whether Britain could or should continue to levy that tax in order to pay, or help to pay, for the ruinous costs of the 7 Years' War. The first World War, the first truly global war, in which Britain had, as we say in England, duffed up the French on 4 continents, and which, it should be said, was a war which had guaranteed the safety of the American colonies. Britain was now seeking to ask to help to pay for it. It was the middle of the session. The county members of Parliament had made the journey from their far-flung constituencies to London for the occasion. A new government under Lord Rockingham was being put to the test. The House of Commons was packed to the rafters, hot and raucous, as arguments and accusations flowed back and forth. Eventually, after many hours of debate, the government got its way. In a classic British compromise worthy of Monty Python's Flying Circus itself, Parliament withdrew the tax from the colonies while nevertheless insisting on its right to tax. It's like that moment, if you remember, in Life of Brian, where Eric Idle insists that he wants to have a baby, and then says, how can you, man? No, I want the right to have a baby. The ultimate result was, of course, a disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, why do I mention this? Because this supreme moment of 18th century political conflict was the moment, the precise moment, when Edmund Burke made his maiden speech in Parliament. Now, I can tell you, ladies and gentlemen, making a maiden speech in Parliament is like your first solo flight as a pilot. Utterly terrifying. You can ask me about my own maiden speech, if you'd like, in the questions. Afterwards, Burke wrote to a friend that he had plunged in, giddy. I felt like a man drunk. That's the first reason I mention it, because it was Burke's maiden speech. The second reason is because although getting drunk might have been a very wise precaution for him in those circumstances, it certainly is not one that anyone would need to speak here tonight in circumstances as congenial as these. Who then, let's start at the beginning, who then was Edmund Burke? Today we think of him as the canonical thinker of representative government, the man who said in his famous speech to the Electors of Bristol in 1774 that your representative owes you not his industry only, not his hard work, but his judgment. And he betrays that judgment if he sacrifices it to your opinion. That is to say, if he gives up his judgment to you, the elector's views, he is failing to discharge his duty as a parliamentarian. It's a ringing statement of the parliamentary principle that I wish parliamentarians in my country were more aware of today than they are at present. I also like to think, however, of Edmund Burke as the Alexis Sanchez of 18th century British parliamentary history. Make one or two adjustments. Very broadly speaking, enormously brave, fuerte como un toro, you know, dashing forward, scoring goals, winning political points, and yet also prepared to track back and support the midfield when that needed some assistance as well. We must never forget that he was an Irishman, born in Dublin on the banks of the Liffey in the year 1730, of a Protestant father, a mixed marriage, a Protestant father and a Catholic mother. He first came to political prominence in the 1760s, as we've seen, amid perhaps the most intergalactic gathering of talent in British history, possibly in any period of history, with the exception of 5th century Athens, perhaps. The age of Dr. Johnson, of David Hume, of Adam Smith, of Edward Gibbon, all of whom were his friends. Over his long career, Burke fought 5 great political battles for more equal treatment of the Catholics in Ireland, against what he saw as British oppression of the 13 American colonies, for constitutional restraints on executive power, the power of the king, royal patronage, against the corporate power and crony capitalism of the East India Company, and most famously against the ruinous influence and dogma of the French Revolution. Their common theme, what W.B. Yeats described in his poem The Seven Sages as Burke's great melody, is his detestation of injustice and the abuse of power. Now, from the outset, Burke was acknowledged not merely as a political force, but as a superlative orator and stylist, and admired as much for his mastery of English prose as he was for his political wisdom. 2 days after his death, the Times was in no doubt about its verdict: Mr. Burke will live as long as strength of imagination and beauty of language shall be respected by the world. Dr. Johnson once remarked that he did not begrudge Burke's being the first man in the House of Commons, for he would be the first man everywhere. And Boswell, James Boswell, once said of him in Parliament, it was astonishing how all kinds of figures of speech crowded upon him. He was like a man in an orchard where boughs loaded with fruit hung about him, and he pulled apples as fast as he pleased and pelted the ministry. Burke's great speech on conciliation gives some flavour of his oratory. The date is March 1775, 10 years after his parliamentary debut, and the American colonies are in uproar over the hated tea tax and the high-handedness of Lord North's administration. Burke makes one despairing attempt to bring Parliament to its senses. His message is plain and bold. The proposition, he says, is peace. Not peace through the medium of war, not peace to be hunted through the labyrinth of intricate and endless negotiations, not peace to arise out of universal discord or to depend on the juridical determination of perplexing questions. It is simple peace, peace sought in the spirit of peace. Why conciliation with the colonies? Because of America's rapidly expanding population, because of its growing commercial strength, but most of all because of the American spirit itself. He says, in this character of the Americans, a love of freedom is the predominating feature. This fierce spirit of liberty is stronger in the English colonies probably than in any other people of the earth. We cannot falsify the pedigree, this is going to be hard for your translators, We cannot falsify the pedigree of this fierce people and persuade them that they are not sprung from a nation in whose veins the blood of freedom circulates. Your speech would betray you. An Englishman is the unfittest person on earth to argue another Englishman into slavery. The speech on conciliation retains its power today. Part poem, part sermon, part homily. It is a stylistic hybrid. Again and again, Burke shows his extraordinary ability to swoop from particular detail to timeless Olympian generalization. A nation is not governed which is perpetually to be conquered, is one such. Or genuine simplicity of heart is an healing and cementing principle. Magnanimity in politics is not seldom the truest wisdom, and a great empire and little minds go ill together. But the speech on conciliation also marked a small but important watershed in political communications. Speeches by parliamentarians had been published before, but Burke's decision to rework and publish major speeches is a deliberate innovation of his. They marked some of the earliest occasions on which publication had been self-consciously used to build a basis of shared knowledge within politics and a reputation outside Parliament, and indeed, such was the interest that his speeches arose and attracted in America, a degree of international renown. In these 5 great political battles, Burke's record of practical achievement was mixed. He often overreached himself. He was a backbencher for almost all of his 30 years in Parliament, rarely exercising executive power from within government himself. And he was variously denounced as, this is another difficult one for the translators, vainglorious, a blowhard, and an irrelevance. His private life was blighted by debt, which he was unwilling to relieve by the means of self-enrichment that were usual for the time. He offended King George III by his severe criticisms of royal influence and by his support for a regency during the king's period of madness. A man of enormous personal warmth and good humor, he lost friends and supporters by his nearly obsessive insistence on the campaigns of the moment. We do have extra seats in the front if you'd like to take one. Nicholas. Ladies and gentlemen, the exam question I've been set this evening is whether Burke was a liberal or a conservative. But this is a university, and I would be a poor scholar indeed if I did not say that this is no easy question that you have set me, Lucia Santa Cruz. No, the matter is far from straightforward for 3 reasons. The first is that the words liberal and conservative did not exist as political labels during Burke's lifetime. They arose in the middle of the 19th century as the main British political parties became more established and settled. Party politics was in its infancy in the 1760s, and it was developed in its theory by Burke in his short book, Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents in 1770. And it was developed in its practice by him as a party manager, almost a modern whip, during his 16 years in opposition, only becoming a political reality when Lord Rockingham formed a government again in 1782. This was a crucial moment in the world's history, because it was the first time a political grouping had been in government, gone into opposition, stayed together in opposition, not dispersing, but united around a core of principles, and then returned to government again. And Burke is at its absolute center. But to call him, or indeed anyone else at that time, liberal or conservative would make no sense at all. The second problem is that there's no simple carryover from the key political labels that people did use at that time, Whig and Tory, to liberal and conservative a century later. Whigs and Tories had been first defined at the time of the exclusion crisis 100 years earlier in 1679 to 81, when a group of MPs had tried to have King Charles II's brother, James, excluded from the succession on the grounds that he was a Catholic and a supporter of absolute monarchy. A mass movement of petitioners developed under the name of Whigs, opposed in turn by Tories who sought to maintain the prerogative rights of the Crown. By Burke's time, these religious associations were still alive, but the term Whig had come to mean a supporter of constitutional monarchy and the rights of Parliament as against those of the Crown. Very broadly, the Whigs were the party of the great aristocrats, the Tories of the minor gentry. The Whigs were more associated with the nonconformist Protestant churches, the Tories with the Church of England. The Whigs began as fiercely protectionist in trade, only to become free traders when it paid them better in the early 19th century. The word Tory had dropped out of political usage by the 1780s. William Pitt described himself as an independent Whig, underlining the ever-shifting political currents of the time. And as the Whig party slowly fragmented, in the early 19th century, many Whigs, especially the followers of Pitt himself, did not choose to join the Liberals. The third problem is that when the words liberal and conservative finally did start to become established in the 1830s and 40s, they continued to evolve as politics evolved, most notably in relation to trade, over which the Conservatives split, and then over Home Rule for Ireland, that's a separate Irish parliament, over which the Liberals split. But even so, a core of more or less coherent ideology continued through on both sides. The Liberals saw themselves as the party of social progress, of individual liberty, of curbs of the power of the Crown and established church, and above all, of free trade. The Conservatives saw themselves as the party of the Constitution, of social order with reform, of the Church of England and of the Union of Nations. In matters of foreign and imperial policy, the Liberal preference was for peace and trade, the Conservative for greater muscularity. Burke's own reputation changed markedly throughout this period. Even during his own lifetime, a myth arose, heavily fomented and spread by Thomas Paine, a man for whom nothing good, in my view, can be said, that he was a lickspittle, a lackey controlled by the great Whig aristocrats, indeed worse, a turncoat and a traitor to progressive causes, because he had supported the American colonists in the first instance, but bitterly opposed the revolutionaries in France. After his death, and even up to the Great Reform Act of 1832, Burke was reviled in Whig circles for having parted company with Charles James Fox, who had supported the revolution, and split the Whigs by going to support Pitt, as it was thought, on a bribe, quite unfairly and untruly. But Burke was also denounced on a host of other grounds, for being unstable, for being a Catholic, for accepting bribes to alleviate his debts, above all for being Irish, at a time when the assumption was that every Irishman in England was out for your fortune or your daughter. From early on, however, there were those who recognized Burke's genius, and as the French Revolution turned from optimism to terror, bloodshed, civil and international war, and finally autocracy, there were some who were brave and independent enough to change their minds. Like many other artists and intellectuals, the Lake poets were initially euphoric about the French Revolution. Wordsworth wrote in his great masterpiece, The Prelude, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." And they were repelled by Burke's politics. Coleridge denounced the older man as a traitor in a sonnet of 1794. "Yet never, Burke, thou drankst corruption's bowl, thee stormy pity and the cherished lure of pomp, and proud precipitance of soul, wildered with meteor fires." I've no idea what that means, actually, but it's obviously rude. But with the passage of time and the growth of experience, both men fell under the influence of Burke. Coleridge's now forgotten final book on the constitution of church and state blends Burkean ideas with British common law and church traditions, and a heavy dose of continental philosophy. As for Wordsworth, his late revisions to the Prelude made his own feelings all too clear. He changes his tune somewhat. "Genius of Burke," he says, "forgive the pen seduced by specious wonders. I see him old but vigorous in age, stand like an oak whose stag-horn branches start out of its leafy brow, the more to awe the younger brethren of the grove." By the latter part of the 18th century, Burke's transformation was complete. He was revered on all sides for the depth, by the latter part of the 19th century, Burke's transformation was complete. He was revered on all sides for the depth of his thought and the power of his language. He was, said William Gladstone, a magazine of wisdom. That's magazine as in armory or weapons store, not magazine as in Kosas or Cosmopolitan. In particular, he was acclaimed for his extraordinary powers of prophecy. Prophecy not through luck, but because of his capacity for analysis, his moral imagination, and his empathy. He had foreseen the loss of the American colonies, and it had come to pass. He had foreseen the violent reaction created by the British oppression of Ireland and the Irish Catholics, and that violence had come to pass. He had foreseen the evil effects of corruption within the East India Company, and they had come to pass. Above all, however, in 1790, when all around him were welcoming the revolution, Burke had predicted the course of events in France. In his most famous work, Reflections on the Revolution in France, he wrote, "In the weakness of one kind of authority, and in the fluctuation of all, the officers of an army will remain for some time mutinous and full of faction, until some popular general, who understands the art of conciliating the soldiery and who possesses the true spirit of command, shall draw the eyes of all men upon himself. Armies will obey him on his personal account. There is no other way of securing military obedience in this state of things. But the moment in which that event shall happen, the person who really commands the army is your master. The master, that is little, of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic." The king would be dead already, guillotined in January 1793. But otherwise, this is a frighteningly exact description of the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1793, the young general was already making a name for himself with the siege and seizure of the port of Toulon, the south of France. In 1799, he staged a coup d'etat, naming himself first consul and moving into the Tuileries. By 1804, he would be Emperor of France. A year later, he would be master of continental Europe. Indeed, in many ways, he was the first conservative. The first person who can properly lay claim to have forged conservatism as a distinctive body of political thought. That idea has been much disputed for all the reasons we've discussed. Burke was, to boot, a thoroughgoing advocate of many liberal measures of reform. So how can he be a conservative, one might ask? Well, political categories are not precisely defined. There are often overlaps between them, but there can be little doubt that he falls on the conservative side of the argument. We must admire the extraordinary period of liberalization that began at the end of the 19th century and that is still with us now, what Deirdre McCloskey has called the Great Enrichment, in which real per capita incomes in the affected countries rose by 30 times, or 3,000%. That is an astonishing change, and it is one which Burke, a quintessentially Enlightenment thinker, helped to launch. But in the final analysis, liberalism, in today's sense of the word liberalism, emphasizes the primacy of the individual. Burke emphasizes the importance of the social order. Liberalism sees freedom as the absence of impediment to the will. Burke sees freedom as ordered liberty. Liberalism believes above all in the power of reason. Burke believes in reason, yes, but acting through tradition, habit, and accumulated experience, or what he calls prejudice. Liberalism stresses universal principles. Burke stresses fact and circumstance. Liberalism is unimpressed by the past. Burke quarries it. Liberalism admires radical change. Burke detests it. The liberal will cannot be made the subject of duties. Burke insists upon them. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is clear. Burke, then, is the first conservative political thinker, but he has no monopoly on conservatism, and his own version has a strongly Whiggish flavor to it. As a political creed, conservatism is not a fully stable body of thought. It contains inevitable tensions between its various principles, such as the tension between liberty and authority. Indeed, the thought that there can be no absolutely consistent, worthwhile ethical theory is a Burkean insight which has eluded some of the greatest moral philosophers today. But it's easy to see why Burke's thought has fitted so naturally into the basic philosophy of the British Conservative Party over the last 150 years. For in addition to its Whiggish roots, his emphasis on the social order and duty reaches out to traditionalists, while his paternalist conviction that politics must help the whole of society engages those moved by concern for the least well-off. Amongst the different Conservative Party tribes, only the 20th century corporatists who believe in collective bargaining can derive no real sustenance from him, I think. Let me close by drawing out some implications of Burke's thought for us today. First of all, I think from a Burkean perspective, the present extreme liberalism and individualism appear now to be in crisis. Various economic and foreign policy disasters have gravely undermined conventional beliefs in the power of human reason alone to resolve political and economic problems, and in the capacity of unfettered individual freedom to deliver personal or social well-being. In many countries, the result of this has been a huge loss of social trust and populism. Secondly, I think we need to think much more deeply about capitalism and markets. In his own time, Burke regarded as his greatest achievement his campaign to restrain the crony capitalism of the East India Company. In effect, he offers a profound critique of what is now sometimes called market fundamentalism. But his critique comes not from the left of the political spectrum, but from the right. Markets are not idolized, but treated as cultural artifacts mediated by trust and tradition. Capitalism becomes not a one-size-fits-all ideology of consumption, but a spectrum of different models to be evaluated on their own merits. The question of social value is always at the fore. Thirdly, Burke's thought rebalances the relation between individuals and society. The individual is not simply a compendium of wants, and human happiness is not simply a matter of satisfying individual wants. The purpose of politics is to preserve a social order which addresses the needs of everyone, of generations past, present, and future, as Ignacio has mentioned. Philosophically, it insists against Hobbes and the social contract theorists that there never was or ever could be a state of nature. Humans are social animals, and their nature is to be in society. The human self is an active social force, not a passive vehicle for happiness of the utilitarians or the atomized individual assumed by much modern economics. This is the deep explanation why Burke urged conciliation with the American colonists and why he attacked the French Revolution. In both cases, he is seeking to protect a settled social order and a settled way of life from upheaval. This was then not an act of treachery, but a fundamentally principled, politically unpopular, brave and consistent position. Fourthly, far from the political caricatures, conservatism in Burke's hand is intrinsically modest in nature. It constrains individualism and the tyranny of the majority. As Burke said, "We are afraid to put men to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, because we suspect that this stock in each man is small, and that the individuals would do better to avail themselves of the general bank and capital of nations and of ages." But his thought is also rigorous in demanding modesty from our leaders. Burke himself was devoted to an ideal of public service and duty, and to holding those in authority, both in great public and private institutions, to account. But in pioneering new forms of political communication, he has a crucial lesson for those of us in politics, in every country, in every party. Your audience is highly intelligent, more intelligent collectively than you know. So you can talk to it, converse to it, with it, learn from and educate it. Indeed, it is your duty to do so. Finally, Burke, like Smith, his friend, has a worldview that is steeped, immersed, macerated, drenched in a sense of history. Again and again, it is to history that he turns for understanding and wisdom. And it is to history, as well as his remarkable imagination, that he owes his astonishing capacity for prophecy. Dismiss history, write off the past, ignore its achievements and disasters, and you open the door to populism. It is a lesson we must never forget. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much, Jesse. Una de las características, dijo Rodrigo, de esta universidad es intentar desarrollar el pensamiento crítico. Así que yo voy a plantear una hipótesis levemente diferente a la que ha planteado Jesse. Pero antes me quiero unir a los agradecimientos que dio Ignacio antes, porque la verdad es que ha sido muy noble y heroico haber venido por 3 días en medio de todos los eventos fascinantes y importantes que están ocurriendo en Gran Bretaña en este momento. Bueno, Jesse tiene mucha razón en señalar el anacronismo del uso de los términos liberal y conservador en el siglo XVIII. Sin embargo, el perfil y las ideas de Edmund Burke lo han transformado en un sujeto de estudio de actualidad, no solamente en el siglo XVIII, sino que en el XIX y en el XX también. Y nos parece especialmente relevante para la discusión chilena sobre las tensiones y concordancias entre los pensamientos liberal y conservador. Yo creo que él tiene mucha razón de decir que las filosofías políticas o las corrientes ideológicas son muy difíciles de encasillar y de definir en forma muy estricta. Sin embargo, mi hipótesis sería que Edmund Burke es un liberal clásico y también el primer conservador. Y digo que es un liberal clásico. Bueno, una de las dificultades de definir el liberalismo es que todos quieren ser liberales. Y ser liberal en Estados Unidos no tiene nada que ver con ser liberal en Chile o con lo que era Adam Smith, tal vez el padre fundador del liberalismo. Pero yo entiendo por liberalismo clásico al menos 3 elementos, que son la importancia de la libertad individual, los límites, por lo tanto, al poder de los gobiernos, que en forma permanente pueden amenazar esa libertad, y en tercer lugar, el aprecio y el fomento de la libertad económica en términos del libre comercio, en términos del funcionamiento general de las estructuras económicas. Bueno, en este sentido creo yo que junto a Locke y Adam Smith es indudablemente una figura señera del liberalismo clásico británico, pero también un crítico vehemente del individualismo liberal egoísta y de la idea de que el bienestar humano depende nada más que de la satisfacción de los deseos y necesidades individuales materiales. Efectivamente, como se ha dicho, toda su vida abogó por límites constitucionales a la autoridad de los reyes y a sus posibilidades extensas que tenía de patronazgo, que aumentaba indebidamente las prerrogativas del monarca, poniendo en peligro lo que él consideraba eran los logros libertarios de la gloriosa Revolución de 1688, que habían consagrado los principios constitucionales británicos. De hecho, yo creo que fue el primero en interpretar la doctrina constitucional que surge de la Revolución Gloriosa en un sentido más amplio, proclamando que la autonomía del Parlamento no depende de un equilibrio de poderes de este con el Ejecutivo, sino de la supremacía de la Cámara de los Comunes frente al monarca, pues las libertades del pueblo inglés están estrechamente ligadas a la independencia del Parlamento. Ahora, fue un liberal de corriente anglosajona, basada en la defensa de las libertades concretas de los pueblos, muy hostil a la tradición francesa de defensa de derechos abstractos y metafísicos de los seres humanos. Las abstracciones metafísicas, sostenía, no son confiables, como tampoco son las proposiciones. Yo voy a necesitar agua, perdón. Tenía un verdadero rechazo a la idea de las abstracciones metafísicas, como también a cualquier proposición que implicara sacrificar a la generación del presente en aras de un bien eventual para la humanidad del futuro. Y debido a este enfoque, concluye, no son las asambleas constituyentes las llamadas a crear instituciones, pues los gobiernos son generados en el tiempo, por la historia y por la experiencia. La perfección teórica, dice, es una quimera en cuya persecución se olvidan la prudencia y la moderación, llegándose al extremo de preferir la perfección completa de la idea abstracta por sobre la realidad. Para él, la definición de una mayoría no es por definición sinónima de lo correcto. Y, cito, la mayoría ciudadana es capaz de ejercer la más cruel opresión sobre la minoría. Y la tiranía de la multitud es una tiranía multiplicada. En este contexto, si se entiende que la democracia es parte intrínseca del liberalismo, ciertamente Burke no sería un liberal. Sin perjuicio de que, reitero que creo que tiene muchos rasgos propios del liberalismo clásico británico, cuyos orígenes intelectuales son muy diferentes a otros del mismo signo continentales, y su rebelión vehemente contra la tiranía, también, como dice Jesse y muchos, fue el primer conservador. Valoraba la importancia de la tradición, la religión, la comunidad, la virtud cívica y el sentido de la historia. Tenía de igual forma el convencimiento de que el orden económico y social debía beneficiar a todos. Pero esa creencia era, por ejemplo, compartida plenamente por Adam Smith, el padre fundador del liberalismo clásico, quien decía que the opulence of a nation is the opulence of everyone. Para él, para Burke, el Estado entonces no es una sociedad como aquella que puede constituirse, dice, para el comercio de la pimienta, el café o el tabaco. No se trata de la agrupación de intereses transitorios y tampoco tiene como objetivo meramente asegurar la grosera existencia animal de una naturaleza efímera y perecedera. El contrato, por medio del cual nace el contrato civil, es, y repito lo que ya dijo Ignacio, una asociación en todas las ciencias, en todas las artes, en todas las virtudes y perfecciones que no pueden ser alcanzados sino en el transcurso de muchas generaciones. Y por eso el contrato social es, comillas, no solo entre los vivos, sino entre los vivos, los muertos, los que están aún por nacer. Es cierto que Burke se opone a la revolución, se opone al cambio drástico, especialmente cuando la revolución adquiere caracteres jacobinos, porque eso amenazaba gravemente la libertad. Pero no era reacio al cambio ni a las reformas. Por el contrario, consideraba que la política exige dos grandes principios. Desde luego, el de la conservación, pero también el de la aptitud de introducir correcciones, pues, cito, un Estado sin los medios para efectuar cambios carece de los medios para su propia conservación. Entonces es necesario velar para que en los progresos que introducimos no seamos nunca enteramente novedosos y en lo que mantenemos nunca enteramente obsoletos. Pues no se trata de mantener rígidamente el statu quo, sino de conjugar armónicamente los procesos de continuidad y cambio. Dice, un país no puede ser concebido como una carta blanca sobre el cual cualquiera pueda escribir lo que desee. Y por eso opina que nadie debería osar, sino con la mayor cautela, derrumbar un edificio que ha satisfecho en un grado tolerable por mucho tiempo los propósitos de la sociedad o reconstituirlo sin tener a la vista modelos probadamente útiles. Bueno, en términos económicos, para Burke, igual que para Smith, el juicio personal individual es siempre más eficaz que el mandato gubernamental. La oferta y la demanda deben regular los precios y los salarios. El hombre puede progresar, pero no le corresponde al gobierno conducir ni determinar el proceso. Por eso, sus atribuciones del gobierno en estas materias deben ser severamente limitadas. Todo esto con una condición. Al perseguir sus intereses egoístas, deben relacionar el éxito individual con el bien general. Yo creo que esa premisa también es perfectamente compatible con el concepto de self-interest en Adam Smith, que nos dice que al perseguir el interés personal se está logrando además un bien social. Bueno, yo creo que esta tarde no vamos a dilucidar la controversia respecto a si es un liberal o un conservador, y las preguntas van a seguir. ¿Fue un liberal utilitario? ¿Fue un continuador de la escuela del derecho natural? ¿Por qué se interpreta en forma tan diversa? ¿No tiene coherencia alguna? ¿Cuáles son sus inconsistencias? En fin, ¿por qué es todavía un personaje que todos quieren rescatar para sí mismos? Pero tal vez debemos aceptar que, como alguien dijo, Edmund Burke fue el primer pensador de la modernidad en manejarse dentro de ciertos márgenes de ambigüedad. Y en este marco no resulta tan paradojal concluir que Burke efectivamente fue uno de los fundadores del liberalismo clásico anglosajón, pero también el primer conservador. Muchas gracias.
Sí, buenas tardes. ¿Cuál era la posición de Burke con respecto al origen de las obligaciones del individuo? ¿Era el consentimiento del individuo, como en el caso del pensamiento contractualista? ¿O él pensaba que las obligaciones provenían de vínculos comunitarios o intergeneracionales o de ese estilo? ¿O era una mezcla de las dos? O sea, o no era claramente ni una ni la otra, sino que algo medio ambiguo, no sé. ¿Cómo se podría clasificar el pensamiento de Burke respecto al origen de las obligaciones de la persona, del individuo?
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I mean, the answer to that is it's a much disputed question in Burke scholarship. Burke is a religious man who regards the social order as a providential gift ultimately arising from God. And so the question of where you locate the sense of obligation as between a natural law reading of Burke or a utilitarian reading of Burke is still a much debated question. But I don't think you can go far wrong in seeing it as rooted in a social principle and a sense of inherited obligation that comes with the wider understanding of society that he has as something that is a trust passed on from each generation from one to another. And in particular, he rejects the social contract notion that, as it were, you signed up to some form of Hobbesian contract from a fear of violent death and therefore have an absolute obligation to obey a sovereign or any of that kind.
I'm going to say it in English because he hasn't got the translation.
Sorry, yeah.
I may tell you that Jesse Norman was the only member of parliament that nobody knew whether he was in favor of Brexit or Remain. Am I right?
Yes, you are right, and it's a small. Thank you for that. I wouldn't have said ambivalent. I would have said discreet. No, I took the view that I took a very Burkean view, actually. I took the view that the arguments were being made very vigorously on each side, and my constituents could hear those. But what they really needed was a piece of advice. And because the circumstances of each person dictated how they would react and what principles they chose, it was perfectly possible for one person to believe in sovereignty. You know, someone in my constituency who'd worked in the army, for example, might believe, I have many army people, I have the special forces in my constituency. So they believe in the sovereignty. They think that's a very important aspect. That's what they've been fighting for. And then I have many people in my constituents who believe in, who worried about economic growth and who had families who wanted to go and children who wanted to study in Europe and thought that might be heard. Everyone had a different set of principles. So I didn't feel bad about that. I thought they needed advice and that's what they got from me. I did get, however, a lot of guano from many of my colleagues and some of my constituents as well. But then I got re-elected without too hard difficulty, so that was okay.
I know.
Well, I say this when everyone mentions my majority, which is, I'm pleased to say, quite large in my constituents. I remind them of two things, which is that the first is that it was a seat that was held by the Liberal Democrats when I arrived in Hereford, and we took it from them and then built up a majority. And the second is that the only reason why that majority exists is because of the hard work put in on the doorstep by my wife and by Luciano Cruz-Coque, who's over there, when he campaigned for me.
Augusto.
Me gustaría mucho saber qué piensa el profesor Norman sobre si hubiera prevalecido la posición de Burke sobre los colonos americanos en 1775. ¿Cuánto habría cambiado la historia del mundo o habría sido un simple retraso respecto de lo que ocurrió en definitiva?
So if I understand, the question was if Britain had prevailed against...
If Burke had prevailed.
If Burke had prevailed on the American...
If his view had
if his view had prevailed on the American colonies, then there would have been no split. And if there had been no split, then it's hard to imagine... Well, there's so many things that might have followed from that. So where to begin? We might have had a much messier... First of all, there may have been no civil war, because there would not have been an American founding that recognized slavery, since Britain had taken a very strong, was in the process of taking a very strong position against slavery. One could argue. One could argue that the Britain would not have tilted towards India at anything like the speed that it did, because it was really seeking to build a new empire, having lost America. And what is fascinating is how Burke articulates an idea of a commercial empire as being where Britain should end up, rather than what you might call an autocratic or imperial empire. He's fighting for that commercial understanding rather than the quasi-military one. But I mean, who can say? It's one of those incredible, imponderable questions.
Nicholas. And
if I may, we are aware that just 100 years ago we had another thing which is possibly even bloodier than the French Revolution. So what would Burke think of the decidedly illiberal tendencies that we see to this day, and with the prospect of perhaps even the next Prime Minister, God forbid, coming from that sort of very highly illiberal sort of background, and we understand that Corbyn is, an enlightened Marxist-Leninist, if such a thing can exist.
Without the enlightenment.
Yeah. I don't know, and you have to live with these guys in Parliament. So, what would Burke think of this? Has society gone backwards?
I mean, it's a wonderful question. I mean, two or three things. What to say? I mean, one of the fascinating things about Parliament is you don't just have, you literally have to live with it, because this person is in Parliament with you in the same building. There's no distancing yourself from the other in a way that people might think, what you can do with the presidential system, where you might never see your opponent. You're going to be with your opponent every single day in the chamber, basically dealing with them. The second thing is that I think, of course, he would have been appalled by the rigid ideology, and I think he would have been mortified by the idea that someone could come to their views in their early 20s and never change their mind. Astonishing. No reflective capability, no moral imagination to kind of reinterrogate one's own thinking and try and make it better, or kind of recognize one's own limitations. So of course he panicked. I think he'd be very worried about that. I need hardly tell you that a cluster of views, and it is a cluster of views, which can bring someone to the particular accommodations that Mr. Corbyn has reached with terrorist organizations, with vicious autocracies in the past, with the celebration of the Russian Revolution and all its extraordinarily evil consequences. And I think the only reason these things can exist is because I think there are two reasons. One is because inadequate work by the government to reassert its own claims to the legitimate support of its people. I don't think we've done enough of a job doing that, and I think people are aware of that, and it was true in the election. I think it's true now. And the other is because for many, many diverse reasons, and they include social media, we are getting a series of generations with a very foreshortened understanding of history. And one of the things I love about this country is that it is still a country in which history matters an enormous amount, and people reflect on it. At least it feels from a British perspective like that to me. And I love that aspect of Chile, and I revere it, and I long for it to continue.
Profesor Norman, si hay algo en que pueden estar de acuerdo tanto conservadores como liberales, es la limitación del gobierno en las actividades de las personas. En ese sentido, un autor correligionario suyo, Philip Blunt, en su libro Red Story, hace una idea bastante atractiva tanto a liberales como a conservadores, que dice que existe la posibilidad de establecer un mercado moralizado, es decir, cambiar las restricciones gubernamentales por fuertes reglamentaciones éticas. En el fondo, ¿qué le parecería esa idea a Edmund Burke y cuáles son las políticas concretas que podrían conllevar esa misma idea?
Well, I'm nervous about the language of morality in terms of moralizing or preaching to people. I think of morals in terms of moral norms and culture. And I think one of the things that differentiates the Burkean and Smithian conception of political economy from economics now is that for them, correctly, all human behavior is actually obeys norms and conventions, and is embedded in culture in a way that I think modern economics is now rediscovering via the back door. And that was kind of the point I was making in talking about the difference between a kind of economic atom, if you like, and this much richer conception of the individual as a socially embedded entity that you find in Burke and Smith. So that's why I slightly part company with Lucia on classical liberalism. For me, classical liberalism begins with Mill, not with Smith and Burke, because it begins with a self-consciously economic reflection on how you might consider someone in their purely economic activities. And Smith never does that. Smith thinks about people in their ordinary course of their lives and then isolates their economic behavior within that, which is a slightly different approach. So I have to say, I looked at Red Tory a bit, but I didn't give it as much time probably as it deserved. Philip and I talked a lot about the ideas in it. But I am nervous about, as it were, I'm not really sure I quite understand what he means by setting, by kind of moralizing within markets, if that's what you're referring to. I mean, every market has got, I mean, let's take an example, slavery. Both Smith and Burke were very early opponents of slavery, at a time when that was not by any means the de facto, the normal position. And it was not the position, let it be said, within the origins of the classical liberal rights tradition, which go back to John Locke. John Locke was a very much recognized slavery and was a supporter of slavery in relation to people captured in war. This is something people forget about Locke when they sing his rights. You know, in the American Revolution, they think about Thomas Jefferson and people, and Jefferson, of course, was an enthusiastic slaveholder himself. So if you think about slavery, neither Burke nor Smith thinks that slavery is, in any sense, a morally acceptable behavior. For Smith, it precisely is a behavior, a form of behavior that does not reflect a reflection about self-interest. He thinks it's against people's economic self-interest. It occurs because of domination, their desire to dominate people. And in Burke and Smith both, in Burke's case, he produced a so-called sketch of a Negro Code, the purpose of which was to regularize the slave trade prior to its abolition. This is well before Wilberforce or Clarkson get going. So, of course, there are markets which we despise on moral grounds. But there's also a slightly more subtle thing that I think we want to look at, which isn't what we think about those markets or other markets we might consider immoral, like the markets for drugs or some, things like that. But what's more interesting in a way is to look at markets where where our feelings are morally mediated. Let me just think if let me think of a good example of that. I'll come back to you afterwards, because there are more interesting examples of markets where our moral norms are starting to shift in ways that change them quite profoundly.
Thanks. See? Do you think it might be possible to explain Burke's support to the colonies in the 1770s because he was Irish rather than because he was, ideologically closer to the founding fathers? Because in the end, the American Revolution was a conflict between Parliament and the colonies, and Burke was a strong supporter of the power Parliament should have over the king. So I think he might have felt closer to the colonies because he was not British in the sense that he understood.
Yeah, I mean, Burke's view is not that Parliament doesn't have the power; it's that it would be insane to exercise the power. He thinks that's the point. Yes, I mean, it's a lovely, that lovely line of Hume's, from David Hume, who is but unmentioned and is a kind of governing genius of this period. But so Hume says, reason is and must ever be the slave of the passions. So we make up our minds based on our passions, and then we use our reason, elaborate processes of self-justification designed to show that we were right all along. Okay, it's classic kind of deflating Humean point, very clever idea. And I think that, there's no reason not to think that some of that might be true. I mean, Burke had experienced what it was like to be the underdog compared to the English overdog, and he consistently backs the underdog for the rest of his life. It's not hard to see a potential link between those things.
Perhaps we could say that Burke was kind of a voice of moderation in the 17th century in the Parliament. I mean, a man admired by Disraeli and Gladstone in the 19th century must be a really powerful moderate. And could you say that his legacy is kind of being misused nowadays? That his kind of moderate voice from Burke, that's the 18th century, is being misused by more radicalized political debate nowadays, like in the ultra-right or...
I mean, honestly, I wouldn't really say that. I don't see much evidence that the ultra-right or other parts of, as it were, the political spectrum, highly religious people, whatever it might be, are using Burke. I do see that with Smith. I mean, very interestingly, Smith, I think, does get quite heavily abused. So on my reading, Smith is not an economic libertarian. It's actually not even far from clear in the strong sense that Smith is even a laissez-faire economist. So for someone to be suggesting that Smith is somehow, thinks there should be no rules on anything, or that, this is just simply not an accurate description of Smith's view. I mean, and Smith's much, much cleverer about markets, for example. So there's a classic kind of rather extreme argument which goes like this. Well, we're living in a world of market fundamentalism and neoliberalism, and that comes about because economics treats all markets like the financial markets, and the financial markets went pop, and this shows how bust economics is, and Adam Smith invented economics, so he's responsible for the whole thing. Okay, that's all nonsense from start to finish. Okay, so it's nonsense on several levels. One is because economics today is much, much cleverer in thinking about markets than anyone who knows who could say that. And the second is even cleverer still. So even in The Wealth of Nations, Smith distinguishes between what you might call product markets and asset markets. He's very, he has an anticipation of Keynes's idea that markets don't clear. He has an anticipation of Veblen's idea that you get markets where the demand goes up with the lack of supply. People get more excited about things the more expensive it is. He has an idea that markets are So in the case of finance, he thinks that there should be party walls separating finance, because when a bank goes pop, it takes everyone down with it. It has incredible social evils. These are not the active. None of this is compatible with the idea of Smith as being a kind of uber laissez-faire or libertarian thinker. It just isn't true. So I think that he's much more vulnerable to that kind of abuse.
Jesse, can I ask something?
Of course.
Isn't it, aren't we rather lost putting this dilemma between competition and cooperation as if they were mutually exclusive? Because one could suggest that markets are essentially a cooperative enterprise. And I'm very hopeful that all the advances in neuroscience, for instance, are going to be able to have a better understanding of human behavior, and will show that although we do have self-interest and we pursue self-interest, we cannot survive if we don't cooperate as well, and we also have that instinct. And in that sense is why I think it's so compatible to be a follower of Adam Smith, who certainly is not what people think of Adam Smith. He's always concerned about other, and he would be horrified at the idea of a homo economicus. But I think that it's perfectly compatible to believe in individual freedom, in small government, etc., and to have a very deep concern for the society where you live.
Yes, I mean, you can have two or three different things. One is when someone, in a condition of free exchange, I'm giving you oranges and you're giving me tomatoes, and that's because I want tomatoes on a net basis and you want oranges, and it's a thoroughly voluntary activity. We're both delighted. Of course, there are oppressive contexts of markets. People can exercise market power in oppressive ways, and one of Smith's key themes is essentially how do you, if we're moving on to Smith, is how do you ensure processes of effective competition rather than to design to kind of prevent that. And you know, there are many examples now in technology where you can have very serious Smithian worries about whether or not there is effective competition, or even in theory could be. I mean, you know, Teddy Roosevelt could use the Sherman Act to break up the trusts at the end of the 19th century. Try breaking up technology giants that have 70% of the market now. You wouldn't be able to do that. Not a straightforward process. So you have that. But the other thing you have with Smith is you also have, because his moral theory, which of course is, I mean, Smith should, as with equal justice, be called the founder of sociology as the founder of economics. Smith's moral theory is one in which we are all of our activities have a potentially moral dimension to them, and a normative and convention-based dimension to them. And so when you see so it's not surprising that when you see so this idea has arisen that somehow market transactions are non-moral. They're kind of over there, and then the moral stuff we do is over here. That's actually not true. Everything is permeated morality. I'll give you a little example of that. So we used to buy a book, right? You went in and you bought a book. Then you bought a book online from someone you'd never met before and never would meet. Okay, did that mean that this was not, in some sense, morally mediated? Absolutely not. Because if they did a bad job now, you send them a star rating on whether they've done a good job or not. What are you doing? You're basically giving them a moral approval tick. Or taking it away from that. Just shows, now, as soon as the capability existed for you to do that, you did it. Because it was always tacitly morally mediated. There's a marvelous chapter in a book called The Challenge of Affluence by Avner Offer on a thing called The Economy of Regard. And really, if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. Very, very interesting. So the idea of the economy of regard is there's an awful lot of our economic transactions that don't have any price or money associated with them at all, but are nevertheless economic activity. And they run off regard. They run off our feelings of esteem, love for each other. And so a lot of the caring professions run on that basis. Bequests inside families run on that basis. Staggering amounts of the economy, you know, and I think I think that's another way of getting at a very Smithian idea that economics is kind of socially embedded.
To finish, I think you must tell us about your maiden speech.
I said, well, I will if you want. First of all, can I just say how marvelous you've been? Thank you so much for a fantastic set of questions. I really appreciate it, and I'm very grateful and honored by your being here. My maiden speech, what to say? It is, as everyone says, a terrifying moment. I had seen maiden speeches crash and burn in front of me in ways that you couldn't imagine. The one I remember most vividly was a man called Chris Evans, who is the MP for Islwyn, which is a seat in Wales. And ever since Lloyd George and Neil Kinnock, the concept of the Welsh windbag is a very well-known one. That's incredibly verbose Welshman who just talks endlessly in his topic. And Chris Evans gave his maiden speech. And when you give a speech in a debate that's heavily attended, the speaker will lay down a limit on the number of minutes you can speak for. And the speaker had laid down a minute count for that debate of about 6 minutes. And it struck just as he was coming to his peroration, just as he was building up to his great moment. So Chris said, and he was waving his arms, he's a Labour MP with a lot of, he said, "And Mr. Speaker, I can do no better than to quote the immortal words of Aneurin Bevan himself, when he said," and at that point, he ran out of time and they called the next speaker. And his maiden speech, catastrophic. Oh. So that was determined to avoid that. So I did it late on a Monday night. And I found myself doing something that you're never supposed to do. You're not supposed to speak in a foreign language in the House of Commons. But I didn't think there was any rule about not doing a foreign accent. And I wanted to tell, and so I had a story, but I wanted to tell, which was, captured my feelings of being in the House of Commons. And I said, when I first arrived in the House of Commons, I was filled with a sense of awe and astonishment and joy at the history that seeped out of the very walls, the stone of the Palace of Westminster itself. And how very different my feelings had been from those of Mark Twain. Because Mark Twain said, and I hope the Speaker and the House would forgive me using an accent, "When I first came to Memphis, I found men drinking and gambling and open prostitution in the streets. It was no place for a Presbyterian, and I did not long remain one."
That's very good.
It got a huge laugh, I'm pleased to say. And for weeks afterwards, I had people coming up to me and saying, "Jesse, that was a thoroughly forgettable speech, but I loved your joke about Mark Twain, and I will be using it with my Conservative Association at the event we're having this weekend," thus showing that politics is show business for ugly people. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.